This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hi friends, it's Justin Brierley. Before we jump into today's show, I've some exciting news to share. The evidence for a rebirth of belief in God in the UK and beyond has been growing. Easter saw thousands of churches packed out, surveys are showing a remarkable upturn in church-going, and people are looking for God again. I believe the church is in a unique missional moment, and that's why I'd like to invite you to a conference, Responding to the Rebirth, taking place at All Souls Church London on Saturday the 22nd of November. Co-hosted by myself and Glenn Scrivener of Speak Life, we'll be joined by some very special guests and speakers as we help the church to be ready for this turning of the tide. This conference is for any Christian who wants to respond to the rebirth we're seeing. Ticketing will be available soon, but for now, mark your diary and plan to be with us on Saturday, the 22nd of November in London. More details to follow soon. For now, here's today's show. How surprised would the Larry Sanger of 25 years ago, the founder of Wikipedia, be to see you now sitting here talking about your conversion to Christianity?
Pretty surprised.
To what extent were you aware of or influenced by those new atheist figures?
I was kind of embarrassed as a non-believer. Rather too easy for people like William Lane Craig to refute the likes of Richard Dawkins. I mean, of course he can refute him. Yeah, I was disappointed. I wanted allies, but these were not them.
By the end of the essay, you describe, a very sort of orthodox set of creedal beliefs.
The whole thing is a system of thought. And the better that one understands the system and how it all hangs together, the stronger one's faith in God is. Skeptic will say, I would have said 10 years ago that, well, you're just imagining this. Well, I'm not sure of that anymore.
Hello there and welcome. I'm Justin Brierley, back with another podcast episode, and today in conversation with Larry Sanger, the co-founder of Wikipedia, whose surprising rebirth story went viral earlier this year when he published an essay about why, as a lifelong analytical philosopher, he's recently converted from atheism to Christianity. And if you enjoy the conversation, do rate and review this podcast. Share it with your friends on social media or just good old word of mouth. It does make a huge difference in getting the word out. And thank you to Danny, who wrote this. Like the truest Christian projects, this podcast cuts through the muddle and offers an alternative to the violence of contemporary politics. The opening episodes of Season 2 have been fantastic, as good as the best of Season 1. Thank you very much, Danny. Now, if you want more Thinking Faith content, don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter. And if you want to help me reach more people like Danny with Thinking Faith, please consider becoming a supporter of the show too. You'll get all kinds of perks when you do that, and I'll give you the full details about that later in the show. But if you do want to jump in to get the newsletter or to support the show, then the links are right there with the show info. For now, welcome back to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, Season 2, Episode 10, my conversation with Larry Sanger.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Larry Sanger is an analytical philosopher whose essay on his conversion to Christianity went viral recently. As the co-founder of Wikipedia back in 2001, Larry knows all about the power of the internet to make knowledge widely available. But a few years ago, he was surprised to find himself being persuaded by the evidence for Christianity after decades of life as a skeptical agnostic. Well, Larry's story seems so pertinent to my thesis that we are seeing a surprising rebirth of belief in God that I invited him onto the show to tell me about his journey, and he very kindly said yes. Larry, welcome along.
Well, thanks for having me. It's you've got a very interesting topic here, I think.
Well, absolutely, and we've been delighted to see the way in which, as I've brought this podcast series together on the back of the book being published, it's been interesting to see the way in which lots of interesting individuals have come out of the woodwork, seemingly in confirmation of the thesis that there is this rebirth, as I say, of belief in God. But yeah, I want to talk about your own story. And I have to say, you know, when you published it on social media, I was suddenly being pinged by lots of different people saying, have you seen this latest story? It's yet another confirmation that something's happening, Justin. I mean, how surprised would the Larry Sanger of 25 years ago, the founder of Wikipedia, be to see you now sitting here talking about your conversion to Christianity?
Pretty surprised. Yeah, I was not expecting it at all, even in 2019. I mean, in 2019, before I started reading the Bible, I was thinking, I can understand why some people might be Christian, but I had not reevaluated the arguments for the existence of God. I still thought the same thing that I did about the Bible. And so the idea that I would be like an evangelist of some sort in 5 years, that would have been too much to ask.
Very surprised then, in short. I mean, going back, it's not that you had a completely godless upbringing. I think you were raised in a sort of Lutheran tradition, though I don't think it was pressed on you very strongly. What led you ultimately to lose whatever shreds of belief you did have in childhood?
Well, I think it began when my family stopped going to church after my mom and dad got a divorce. And then I took a philosophy class when I was in my junior year of high school, which was very interesting to me because I was a very inquisitive kid, so much so that some people would say that I asked too many questions. The philosophy certainly appealed to me for that reason. But then the following summer, I was just noticing how people surrounding me in my life had made all sorts of really bad, unforced errors that were due to their own falsehoods, things that they had believed that were false. Like the druggies, because this is, I'm talking about the 1980s, the early 80s, that the drug scene was still very, hip. That the druggies that I knew they actually believed that drugs were a way of expanding the mind, which I think I still think is a complete falsehood, and a dangerous one too. And I just thought to myself, well, there's all kinds of different falsehoods, and maybe I am entertaining all kinds of falsehoods that would ruin my life, and so I actually came to the same sort of conclusion that Descartes did in his Meditations on First Philosophy and Discourse on Method. So what Descartes said was, if you really want to have certain knowledge, you have to undergo a process of systematic doubt. You get rid of all of your beliefs and build from whatever is known clearly and distinctly, as he put it. I basically said, if I don't know what I am believing, and I don't in other words, I can't characterize it clearly, and I have no good reasons, really, actually firm reasons to believe it, then I can't say that I know something. And that was a high bar, essentially. And so my belief in God kind of went out with that. Around
and this led you to what you came to call methodological skepticism, this idea that you should only believe things that you have enough justification, enough evidence to warrant that kind of belief. It was quite a sort of a logical way of approaching life, but certainly, as you say, God didn't appear to meet the criteria for believing at that point.
Sure. I mean, it's it's the more rational thing that underlies what is now called scientism. So scientism tries to reduce or make a model of all of knowledge to science, and which is ultimately nonsense, because there's other kinds of knowledge than scientific knowledge, like mathematics and logic and a number of other things, actually, I think. Not necessarily religion. And I always would have said that. No, the thing that's important, that's underlies that, is that you don't make up your mind about something until all the facts are in, essentially, until you have considered all of the evidence on both sides and you rationally decide what you're going to believe, if necessary. And maybe the best thing is to just continue to withhold the belief, as they say. So not decide, which again was my position on God.
And you described yourself as a kid who arguably asked too many questions. I mean, in the essay, it comes out that actually part of the reason for you sort of giving Christianity a miss in the end was because you did sometimes ask those difficult questions and you never received satisfactory answers, by the sounds of it. There's one particular episode you recall, I think, in the essay where you talk about going and asking someone about the questions you had, and you just felt it kind of put the nail in the coffin, as it were, of whether you felt Christianity had any credibility at that point.
I was already well down the road, but I wanted to engage with people especially about the existence of God. I had a couple of other interests, but that was definitely one of them. And I thought, well, who better to answer my questions than pastor? I don't think it was the pastor that I had younger, like 5 years before that, when I was confirmed in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. It was somebody else, but he was off-putting. Basically, seemed to dismiss my questions. It was just a phone call, so it probably didn't seem that significant to him. And I don't think I was terribly mocking, but I was probably not as respectful, especially because kids today are even less respectful than we were back in the 1980s. But the older school in the 1980s would have expected a certain kind of respect and deference, which I probably didn't signal quite enough. And so I don't want to blame him here or anything like that. I'm just saying that I didn't get any answers out of him, and I got the impression that he felt a little threatened by me. Whether he actually was or not, I don't know. But that's the impression I got, and it made a big difference actually after that.
Yeah. It's not the first time I've heard that, obviously, I'm sure, nor for you either, that sadly the inability very often of church leaders to sort of answer often some fairly simple questions can obviously make young people feel, well, there can't be that much in this if they're not willing to take my questions seriously or haven't even perhaps thought about them.
They were philosophical questions, right? They weren't theological questions. And if somebody has not been adequately trained in philosophy of religion, or what's called natural theology, then there's a pretty good chance that he's just not going to know how to answer. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm glad to say, in a sense, that I think within Christian circles, there's been something of a renaissance in recent years where a lot more Christians probably do feel a bit more prepared to engage with the philosophical issues, partly because of the rise of new atheism. And I think that led to a concurrent sort of development of ministries of a philosophical nature seeking to respond to typical objections to God from a philosophical point of view. But certainly, by the time you were in college and then graduate college, you were an agnostic, and you started teaching philosophy. And that, of course, gave you the opportunity to look at and to convey some of the typical arguments for God from philosophy of religion. But I don't think you ever found them very compelling at that stage, did you?
No, I didn't. Basically, the biggest misgiving I had, although each different argument had its own weaknesses, I thought, but the one that they all had in common, which was the most damning, I thought, was that, the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. So just to take the example of the argument from contingency, the argument goes very briefly something like this. There are all kinds of things that could have been otherwise, like a bird flies by my window. It didn't have to fly by my window, but there's a reason, according to a scientific frame of mind, that would explain why it had to fly by my window just at that time. And when we're like constructing our theories of the world, our understanding of how it all works, ultimately what we're trying to do is to explain how all of these contingent facts actually were necessary. They actually had to be where they were at the time they were, and so forth. But here's the interesting thing. The fundamental laws of nature, the constants, and just the age of the universe, these are all like things that are ultimately irreducible. In other words, you can't really explain them in terms of anything else, and yet they seem contingent too. They could have been otherwise, right? So either we say there is no explanation of all of those things, which is not a very scientific approach. We're just giving up science there because we've run out of explanations, or we say that there's something outside of the very structure of space-time, and that then what philosophers call the nomological structure of the laws, the structure of the laws that explain the universe. There's something outside of all of that that explains why they had to be. And that, here's the conclusion, and this we call God. As I would go, what? Wait, no, that doesn't follow. All that follows from that is that there is a necessary being that exists outside of space-time that explains it all. That's all it follows. I still think that, though, you see. And the same goes for most of the other arguments. They start from a certain place, they end at a certain place. But it's only like down on the basis of many other arguments where you actually find an argument that has plausibly the conclusion God exists, especially the God of the Bible exists. So that was my big objection, that each of those arguments, they just don't establish the conclusion.
Right. They didn't meet this this standard you had set, this methodological skepticism, certainly. And we'll come to why you started to kind of rethink some of those arguments, why you started to read the Bible and so on in just a moment's time. Before we get to that, I do want to take a slight detour from this sort of philosophical and spiritual quest you ultimately went on to talk about the fact that while you were teaching philosophy in the early 2000s, you did co-found Wikipedia. Just tell us briefly about that. What were the circumstances that led to that, and what, I suppose, were you hoping to achieve in doing such a thing?
For reasons I won't get into, I decided not to pursue an academic career. And so I was sort of casting about for things to do. And I had started a website before that. And an acquaintance of mine, Jimmy Wales, said, I've registered this domain name, nupedia.com, would you like to come to work for me and start it? And it's like, wow, starting an encyclopedia, that's like perfect for, a young philosopher. So like I jumped at the chance. And Nupedia, as I and the sort of volunteers that I recruited designed it, was a very slow-moving academic. The editorial process was much too arduous. And then after 9 months or so, Jimmy Wales and I were well agreed that it needed something to supplement it. And so to make a long story short, I had dinner with a friend of mine who was telling me about wikis. And the way he described it, he said, well, this is really, really easy to edit. And yet, even though anyone can edit any page on the website, it still is really useful stuff. It isn't just nonsense, garbage, vandalism. So I said, yeah, we might be able to use that to solve this problem. And so the idea was basically born of a wiki encyclopedia. I proposed it to Jimmy Wales. Can you install this software? Because it was free software. And like he did. Like I started populating it with rules and stuff like that. Again, to make a long story short, it was launched on January 15, 2001. And I managed it for the first 14 months after that.
Right. Did you ever expect it to become the sort of go-to internet resource on the internet for knowledge and that kind of thing?
No. I mean, any ambitious young man can have lots of dreams, but expectations, definitely not. Yeah, I tried to be modest, at least in my expectations. I could see fairly early on how it could end up that way because it just took off so quickly, especially due to Google's support, basically. Sometimes it's called the encyclopedia that Google built. The way it works then was the Google bot, as it was called, then would spider the site. It would go and grab all the new articles, index them, and suddenly there'd be a new influx of new people after that happened coming to the new pages, and so it just the effect was exponential.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I mean, it's just become part of the landscape now, hasn't it? As a kind of website that people immediately know what it is and what it's for and use it all the time. I mean, those early 2000s, though, there's a few things that characterize it. Firstly, of course, in that year, 2001, there was 9/11, and that, in a way, was the catalyst to some degree for something else that took off in the mid 2000s, which was new atheism. And that was, interestingly, a largely internet-fueled phenomenon. Certainly it allowed lots of skeptics to get together and have common cause in chat rooms and other things. But it also kind of gave the early kind of social media platforms for people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris to sort of start to talk about the danger that religion represents to the world, to, be able to sell these best-selling anti-God books. And yeah, for a number of years, this new atheist phase was sort of rode high in the best-selling charts in the public square and so on. To what extent were you aware of or influenced by those new atheist figures?
No, not really. I mean, I had already taught the arguments for the existence of God many times in the previous 10 years. And then I taught philosophy of religion a couple of times after I got my PhD. And I was kind of embarrassed as a non-believer by the books. I looked at them in bookstores and I was flipping through and this is just like popularization stuff and not very good at that, actually. I thought it was rather too easy for people like William Lane Craig to refute the likes of Richard Dawkins. I mean, of course he can refute him. And that's what I said at the time before I was a believer myself. He's a professional philosopher, first of all, and Dawkins is not. And he's studied and written about the arguments in depth, and Dawkins has barely scratched the surface. I could do better than this guy, is what I was thinking. And both sides struck me as being far too glib, essentially. So, I was disappointed. I wanted allies, but these were not them.
Why I'm Still a Christian. After 2 decades of conversations with skeptics and atheists, the reason I believe. That's the title of my new book, and it's available now. Read my case for faith after a lifetime hosting debates between atheists and Christians. Find out why God makes sense of human existence, value, and purpose, and learn how to respond to some of the toughest objections to faith. This is a book to inspire confidence in Christians and to help seekers explore the claims of Christian faith. Why I'm Still a Christian is available now at justinbrierley.com, where you can also get exclusive signed copies. Or, when you become a gold level supporter of this show, you'll get a free signed copy of both my books. Click the link with today's show info to buy or to support.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second LTE internet plan with smartphone plan savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
As I explained briefly before we started recording, my own experience of sort of living through that era and hosting a lot of conversations was that it was quite fun in some ways. It was quite dramatic, some of these set piece debates that took place between the new atheist names and the Christian thinkers. But as you say, it was often more rhetoric than reason involved in the new atheism. And I think to some extent, a lot of people got tired of the heat that was generated. And I increasingly met atheists and agnostics who said, well, don't judge me by the likes of Richard Dawkins and so on. They sort of started to distance themselves really from the movement. And even, over time, I began to see more and more people sort of being willing to not simply dismiss Christianity out of hand, certainly at least not at a cultural level. And I think that sort of was part of your journey. You started to realize actually that Christianity, even if you didn't believe in its supernatural claims, that you weren't ready to necessarily dismiss it as the root of all evil, as Richard Dawkins called it, or as Christopher Hitchens described. So what was that process for you?
So I never thought that Christianity was the root of all evil. I always thought that was actually not just false, but kind of outrageous. obviously false. Just looking at history, that's one thing that atheists like to talk about. And I think it's quite the reverse. I think that, apart from the religious wars, religion had a great civilizing, Christian religion in particular, had a great civilizing influence. And I was willing to admit that. And I thought that, if the new atheists have these serious problems with being able to understand the other side at all, I was thinking, well, maybe at another level I am having some trouble. I was willing to sort of entertain that doubt a little bit. And I can give you an example of something where my point of view shifted slightly. So when I was a graduate student, I thought when I was being most precise, I called myself not an agnostic and certainly not an atheist, but somebody who took the no concept view. So in other words, I don't actually think I even have a concept of God, so I can't say even whether I believe that God exists or not. And the reason I said that is I don't have any conception of what it means for a mind to create things in physical reality from nothing. I have, when I create things, my mind tells my hands what to do. And that is definitely not our notion of and also this is supposed to be something that exists outside of space-time, a mind that exists outside of space-time. This is not a mind of any sort that I know. Okay, so then I had the following thought around about 2017, so much later, 20 years later. I said to myself, it looks like AI is really heating up. What if the singularity actually does come about? What if not just that, but that society develops for another 100,000 million years, billion years, and at singularity levels of development? Like, who knows what that would even look like? I have no idea. But science fiction can't imagine. There's a book called Ringworld by I think his name is Larry Niven, and it posits a super advanced technology that actually creates these enormous rings around stars that harvest their energy and you can live on them, et cetera, et cetera. It struck me as possible that after millions of years of development, that such a thing might exist, but then just extrapolated a little bit more. If you can create these sorts of things, why can't you create new stars? And why can't you create galaxies? And then why can't you create universes? And then the question is, what really is the significant difference between that and God, right? So all we're doing is saying such a thing exists as a necessary entity in itself. That's the only difference. And wow, so that sort of gave me a way to conceive of what God is like. I'm not saying now that I think that is what God is like. I don't think that. But I'm just saying that's interesting. So I didn't actually come to the kind of silly conclusion that some people do, that this is all a what's the word? A simulation.
Yes, a simulation. That's sort of been put out there by people like the names escapes me now, but yeah, there's been various philosophers.
Elon Musk drew that conclusion anyway.
Yeah,
he was sort of famous for doing that. Well, it just doesn't follow, obviously. My conclusion follows just as well, or what would ultimately be my conclusion. So, namely, that if we understand now how everything that we see around us could be designed, right? If it's not beyond our bare notions of technological possibility, then, well, what does that mean? I guess it means that we can conceive of God in a certain way. At least we should be able to take the idea more seriously than we did before, which was actually, I think that's the appropriate conclusion.
So you were kind of toying with the idea, and you were sort of realizing, oh, maybe it's not as crazy an idea as I once thought.
I think that's right. That's right.
Yeah, and I think you obviously this period led you to think perhaps you hadn't give Christianity a fair shake up to that point, and so I don't. Did you start to reconsider some of these arguments for God that you had obviously touched on when you were teaching philosophy? I think in the end, from what I've read of the essay, that it's not that any particular argument suddenly hit you afresh and made you think, "Gosh, God must exist," but that you recognize that actually, when you put them all together, there's a sort of a cumulative strength to a variety of arguments for God.
That's right. So the thing that was interesting, the thing that really caught my attention more than rethinking the arguments for the existence of God was simply reading the Bible and coming to grips with the fact that my former objections had histories of answers to them, whole industries of answers to some of them, that went back for thousands of years, and the answers were actually coherent. And I hadn't really fully understood that before, and I was. At first, I didn't believe the sort of theological resolutions of the problems that people see in the Bible, but I acquainted myself with what apologists say over and over again, and the more I understood the case, the more the case for the overall picture of the world that the Bible portrays began to make sense. That was the thing that was really shocking to me, that shifted my point of view. But at the same time, like I was almost forced to reconsider the arguments for the existence of God when I was rereading the Bible. Or not rereading, when I was reading it for the first time, all the way through for good understanding. Because, no, I'm not really sure. I actually think to answer your earlier question, I actually did think a little bit about the arguments for the existence of God in the months before. I think I might even have a blog post about it that I've written before that. I can't remember.
I suppose what I found fascinating was that you did obviously feel this compulsion to go to the Bible, something that you, I guess, sort of dismissed as, just a work of fiction, Bronze Age goat herders, as the New Atheists might have termed it. But you obviously this kind of growing awareness that there might be something in this, perhaps I should give this a second look, led you to the scriptures. But why specifically did you kind of go on this deep dive into the Bible? I think you published a blog about doing a 90-day kind of reading the Bible in 90 days and that kind of thing. And obviously trying to put all the pieces together in that time. What made you actually think, well, this is a worthwhile thing to do?
Well, I would have to go back to the previous summer. So a friend was telling me about the various pedophile rings from around the world and saying, these aren't just like lower class deadbeats. These include some rich, powerful, famous people. Like, he told me about Jeffrey Epstein before it became very popular to talk about him, and then Jimmy Savile, and the other scandals, the pedo Wood, the Rotherham debacle, that just absolutely awful stuff. The thing is, he maintained that the people behind these, and he showed me lots of sort of circumstantial evidence of this, were essentially occultists. That when they rape children, they're actually engaged in a certain kind of rite sometimes. He was like pushing me to like read these books and about the occult. And I started looking at some of them, and I found them very disturbing. Like if these people take such enormous personal risks, and if it's like connected to power, and there are brilliant but evil people involved, maybe there's like something to this. At least that's one of the hypotheses to consider, because it's so absolutely disturbing. Well, what I decided then is I'm not going to actually study the occult at all. On the off chance that there actually is something there, and there are spiritual doors to open, I want those doors to stay shut. And if it turns out, I told my friend that if there is a spirit world at all, which I certainly didn't believe at the time, if there were, then I would certainly want to be on the side of God. I know that. So I didn't like start reading the Bible right away, but one of the thoughts that occurred to me repeatedly is that if you really want to understand the occult without actually studying the occult, which I don't recommend, you would read the Bible and understand the Bible very thoroughly, because the occult is, to a very great extent, a reaction to the Bible. It is a perversion of biblical doctrines and symbols. So that basically, and then when I got into it, so I just decided, out of the blue, I was looking for some nighttime reading to start reading the Bible. And after a couple of days, my old philosophical study skills started kicking in and demanding that I understand what I was reading better. And like, okay, I've heard of these things called study Bibles. I guess I'm going to get my hands on a study Bible. And I started reading the answers to questions, because that's really what a good study Bible is. A common question you might have, you look in the study Bible and under the verse in question, and then you'll find an answer, maybe. It didn't have, the one that I used most, the ESV Study Bible, didn't have answers to everything. So I started looking in BibleHub.com, which has a bunch of old commentaries. And I looked at a whole assortment of commentaries on certain questions. And then, sometimes the commentaries didn't answer general questions. And so I'd have to go online and just type in a general question, like, why did God order the Israelites to kill men and women and children in invading the Promised Land? And I started reading about that, and I wasn't immediately convinced, but the things that it said were a lot more interesting and plausible than I thought of. Maybe the thing that struck me the most is the people who are writing these answers are actually not idiots. They're actually, pretty smart.
I mean, you found yourself almost by accident, in that sense, doing theology. You were essentially trying to make sense, systematize find the coherent sort of thread throughout the whole thing. And you, it sounds like you were quite surprised to find it was more coherent in the end. And yes, I'm sure there were lots of questions and perhaps things that remain somewhat mysterious. But it turned out that the Bible, once you actually settle down to kind of read it on its own terms and to kind of engage with some of the best thinkers who have taken the time to look at it, you were surprised actually by what you ended up with. So to what extent did that sort of, I suppose, were you finding yourself edging to your own surprise more and more towards Christian belief by this point? And what was the sort of point at which you tipped over, if you like? Because this was obviously then going on with this philosophical quest to sort of re-engage those arguments for God. I mean, what for you was if there was one, a sort of defining moment in that sense?
I mean, not really. It was very gradual. There did come a time after I had sort of experimentally talked with God, having just dialogues in my own head about how God might respond to me on certain things that I would ask. And at some point, I had to admit to myself that I was actually kind of praying to God in the things that I was saying, and I thought, it's hard to both remember and also to reduce a complex thing to a single thought. But when lying in bed at night one evening, I decided that I should direct my prayers to God explicitly, and that I should acknowledge that I am actually accepting him as the master of my life, and that I don't necessarily believe everything in this book that I'm reading, but the overall picture that of God, especially, that it is presenting is very compelling. I'm not saying it was easy for me to do this at all. It wasn't. In fact, I thought I was being kind of irrational at the time. And yet I have convinced myself otherwise simply by the fact that I was consistently and over able to answer my own questions better and better over time in a way that actually satisfied a lot of the sort of rational misgivings that I had.
Summer's here, and you can now get almost anything you need for your sunny days delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get a chicken parmesan delivered. A cabana? That's a no. But a banana? That's a yes. A nice tan? Sorry, nope. But a box fan? Happily, yes. A day of sunshine? No. A box of fine wines? Yes. Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details.
This episode is brought to you by the Toyota Grand Highlander. From daily routines to life-changing adventures, the Toyota Grand Highlander is spacious, powerful, and ready to take on life's grand challenges. Advanced safety features and innovative technology give you confidence for whatever life throws at you. And it's available in a hybrid Nightshade Special Edition, which includes sophisticated gloss black exterior accents and 20-inch black alloy wheels. Learn more at toyota.com/Grand Highlander. Toyota, let's go places.
The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
But I must say that at a certain point also, I had to admit that I was giving up my methodological skepticism, because methodological skepticism is very strong. Basically, it says you can't know anything with certainty, and therefore you shouldn't affirm anything about matters that are sufficiently complex. Anything that is too complex to be able to really truly justify, stuff about politics, stuff about psychology, is just too complex to be able to say you really know, you have knowledge about such subjects. And the same then applied to religion for me. And I ended up saying, well, I'm going to have to make an exception, at least for religion, at least for God.
But what kind of was making you want to sort of feel like you had to park, in a sense, that methodological skepticism, that very high bar? Was it, in a sense, I mean, I'm tempted to use the word faith here, though I don't want to use that as a kind of, to say that that's somehow contrary to reason. But it sounds as though you had reached a point where you felt you had certainly enough evidence to suggest that there was something here, but it felt like you probably had to do something other than simply amass a critical amount of evidence to engage it. There was something else that needed to happen.
Well, I'm going to have to ascend my hobby horse here. When you mentioned faith, for me, being told that I have to have faith in order to believe that God exists was an admission that the belief in God is irrational. And since I wanted to be entirely rational, that was a very good reason not to believe in God. Well, I don't think that way about faith anymore. The faith that saves is trust or loyalty in God. As a matter of biblical exegesis, I've satisfied myself on that point. There are very, very few texts where pistis in Greek must be understood as the acceptance of a proposition, as opposed to faith, loyalty, adherence in God. And that is the thing that saves, certainly not the acceptance of any particular propositions. So, this is how I put it to answer your earlier question then. I say that I can actually rationally justify my theological beliefs to a very great extent. You have to understand that the rational defense really requires that an entire case be made. In other words, it is a worldview, and the justification is, to a great extent, it's sort of it looks like a mutually supporting, coherent set of beliefs. It's a coherence system, as epistemologists might call it. Okay, so now, does this mean that at any point you have to say there are no reasons at all for a certain thing that you believe other than revelation? Yes, actually, you do have to say that. Sometimes the only reason that you're believing something is revelation, except for the fact that the revelation itself is part of the system, right? That means that it's not opposed to reason, insofar as revelation itself can be defended, and insofar as the entire system can be defended on the basis of arguments in natural theology. It's clear to me that it is profoundly rational. In fact, I think it's more rational than the denial. Is it more rational than, well, being entirely without beliefs? Well, yeah, maybe. But what if you're in the position where you say, you know what, I actually want to make up my mind on the question. right? So if there is one thing where I agree with the traditional analysis of these questions, it is that there does come a time when you are saying, I'm resolving to take a stand on a controversial issue and align myself with a certain broad body of thought. It's just that isn't a leap of faith. I mean, it might seem that way, and it can be understood that way and argued that way for people who don't understand the case behind it. But I'm saying the whole tradition of theology and all of Scripture lies behind that. And, if relatively, unscholarly people are saying, well, I just have faith that God exists, what I would tell them is, you're not actually being as irrational as some people say you are, or as you might think yourself to be. You're not. In fact, you actually have a lot of good reasons that you have thought about over the years that lie in the background. And there is no 5-year-old even who will simply believe that God exists because mommy and daddy say so. They actually have other reasons, just for example, there's churches, they're devoted to God. That's one. That's only one. There's a whole body of beliefs. It makes a system. And why do we ignore that? Well, we shouldn't.
Well, quite. And obviously, by the end of the essay, you describe, a very sort of orthodox set of creedal beliefs that you've kind of come to believe. Now, obviously, that took a period of time as you thought through each of these, and you kind of. But it's, as you say, it's not that you sort of. They're all interlinked. They're part of a bigger framework that makes sense of not just the Bible and the story that you were looking at, but the world around you. It's a sort of, to me, it's as though you stepped into a particular worldview, and as you began to look at the world through this idea that there is a God, that He's been revealed to us in Jesus Christ, that there is this story of creation, fall, redemption, new creation. It sort of it sounds as though it not only began to make sense at a kind of coherent, logical level, but it sort of started to make sense of the world you found yourself in as well.
Well, I'll tell you this: if you're referring to the part of my essay called "What I Believe," I think that's what it's called. It's my credo toward the end, and I wrote that from both the mind and the heart. In other words, I understand everything that I wrote. I've read and written about all of it, mostly privately. And not just that, but I sincerely believe those things. And I wouldn't have written down something that I didn't sincerely understand and sincerely believe. The reason I say this is, although it sounds like my own rewrite of an Orthodox credo, there are parts of it that don't, actually, if you look at it. They are essentially my, faithful reconstruction of Orthodox Christian belief. In a way, I was trying to make it my own. Of course, it isn't my own, it's God's. And I'm trying to represent God's truth in a way that I actually really did understand and believe. My goal in writing that was to make sure I wasn't saying something that I didn't believe. I mean, there's certain things there, when I'm talking about like the double procession of the Holy Spirit, for example, that I can't hold forth on at great length. There's a lot of things there that I need to study better, for sure. But I do believe them, and here's the interesting thing. when, like 6 years ago, when I was not a believer at all, I would look at that and I would say, okay, well, how do you know this? How do you know this? How do you know this? And like asking for arguments on each point, not really understanding that the whole thing is a system of thought. And the better that one understands the system and how it all hangs together, the stronger one's faith in God is, not irrational acceptance of the propositions in the credo, but the stronger your faith in God is. The object of faith is God. The object of understanding here is the doctrine.
I also really appreciated in the essay the way that you referenced your kind of growing understanding of why this had to be the way it played out, the biblical story, Israel coming to a culmination in Jesus, addressing some of those common skeptical questions. Well, why couldn't God have just revealed himself, obviously to everyone, and why this particular method? It rather reminded me of hearing Richard Dawkins in conversation with John Lennox, and Dawkins sort of very flippantly dismissing the Bible and Jesus, saying, well, why on earth, if there is a God, would he do it in this backwater of, the Middle East, in this, 2,000 years ago. And I think that's another example of someone who's never really grappled, who's never bothered to take the time to really understand. It's been such a joy talking to you. And as I say, you've been on a very analytical journey. Your journey is probably somewhat unusual compared to the way that most people who find their way to faith come to faith. What I'm interested in as well, though, is to what extent your faith in any way comes from personal experience, spiritual experience. Because in the essay, you write quite candidly that when you did finally pray to God, you certainly didn't have any ecstatic experience or anything. It was rather underwhelming, arguably. Is there any sense in which you do seek or have experienced any kind of communion, spiritual experience with God?
I think so. I think I feel the presence of God constantly. Skeptic will say, I would have said 10 years ago that, well, you're just imagining this. Well, I'm not sure of that anymore. I actually think that he is there, and what I am feeling is what the philosopher William Alston called perception of God. And I think the Holy Spirit makes himself available to us. And that actually is another part of the case for the existence of the Christian God. It all fits. This is one of the main reasons why in fact, maybe the strongest reason why I ultimately came to believe in God. I think the strongest reason that many Christians say is, I can feel him there, even if they don't audibly hear a voice that they attribute to God, right? I imagine God responding to me in all sorts of ways. I'm not under any illusions that it is anything other than imagination. But on the other hand, I think if the Holy Spirit indwells me, as I believe, then he is, helping me through my process of imagination. He's making use of my own thoughts. I wish God would speak audibly to me, I suppose. But maybe I'm too much of a skeptic to think that it would actually be from God. It doesn't matter. That wouldn't change my loyalty to him. That's the interesting thing.
Right. That's interesting to hear. And I think for me, having spoken to many people about their different journeys to faith, it just is a fact that some people are wired to go a more analytical route. And but I would say it's a false dichotomy to say God is not speaking to me, because I think God can use all kinds of means to speak to people. And if rigorous philosophical arguments and sort of making sense of the Bible is one way in which God may speak to you. It doesn't have to be some sort of ecstatic visionary experience necessarily, though, we don't discount those either necessarily. But really, really interesting and encouraging to hear your story, to see it pop up recently. I don't know what you make of my sense that I've been putting out in the book and podcast series that I mentioned earlier, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, that there has been something of a shift in our culture away from that new atheism, away from that hyper-skepticism, that scientistic approach to life, that sort of allowed the God conversation back in the public square, that's led to, I think, a lot of young people especially starting to take the Bible seriously again, in sort of in the way that you began to a few years ago. What do you get any sense of that happening around you?
I do, but there's a dark side of it. So, yes, there are lots of new celebrity converts, but then as almost as many seem to deconvert or shift off to something else, or immediately show their heresy and never recant that, like Kanye West.
Yes, that's a cautionary tale, isn't it, of someone who suddenly, everyone was talking about and has gone off in a very dark direction, sadly. Yeah.
Yes. And not just that, I think a lot of the interest it's a desire for something spiritual, perhaps, wherever that comes from. I think perhaps there is indeed a hunger for to know our Maker, but it seems to be channeled, so to speak, in unhealthy directions, because people don't take the Bible seriously. They believe, as I did, that it was a work of Bronze Age shepherds who were largely ignorant of the world and had unremarkable wisdom. Well, if that is really what you think the Bible is, then you might very well start looking to other religions and sort of try to come up with your own cafeteria style religion. And from a Christian point of view, this is very dangerous. It's very disturbing, in fact. Such people can come to the one true holy God. But it can be hard, especially if they get in the wrong sort of social situation. Well,
it's certainly true that there's all kinds of other options on the table for people, and I've certainly noticed that in talking about the renewed interest in spirituality, especially among Gen Z, that we're seeing. But it can manifest in all kinds of different directions: esoteric, new age spiritualities, manifesting, witch talk, crystals. There's all kinds of things on the table. I suppose I have hope, though, that your story and others like it shows that there is a sort of, that when you go looking and really searching, as the Gospels put it, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. There is this coherence that meets people. There is this underlying story that seems to make sense of reality, far more arguably than I would say than any of those other, cafeteria style ways of engaging religion. And it sounds obviously that you have been someone who has discovered that in your life. And I'm very grateful for the way in which your own story is evidently going to continue to impact others who are perhaps starting out on a similar journey, Larry.
I hope so. I'm at work on a book. I don't know when it's going to be ready, but for the last 5 years, actually, it actually began as an explanation of my new understanding of arguments for the existence of God, and it is now essentially an explanation of the system that is Christian belief, except it isn't theology. It is a combination of natural theology and what I call the argument from Revelation, which does rehearse a lot of basic theology, but in a way that explains it to people and makes sense of it and defends it against the sorts of objections that I would have had back in the day. And the goal is to essentially bring it all together as a unified whole, sort of exhibit the coherence of Christianity against the sorts of radical doubts that I had when I was younger.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with me today, Larry, and all the very best as you go on to write and publish this book as well. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Larry Sanger, and there is a link to the full essay he wrote about his conversion with today's show, and to his Substack where you can read more of his writing. By the way, you can also watch this episode on our YouTube channel as well. But I wonder what you thought about it. Do feel free to email me your thoughts, feedback@think.faith. I have to say, I'm seeing more and more surprising stories like Larry Sanger's popping up in all kinds of places, thinking people, intellectuals coming to faith. But it's also being met by a surprising rebirth among the public too. And if you haven't seen it yet, go and check out my full conversation with Rhiannon McAleer of the Bible Society UK about the quiet revival going on in the UK and the phenomenal rise of young people attending church. Something is definitely happening, folks. And by the way, if you haven't already heard, I'm co-hosting a conference with Glenn Scrivener of Speak Life in London this autumn, responding to the rebirth. The tide of faith is turning and we want to help the church be ready. So mark your calendar for Saturday, the 22nd of November at All Souls Church London. Fantastic guests will be joining us and the ticketing opens soon. By the way, if you want more Thinking Faith content, I'll send you a free chapter from my new book, Why I'm Still a Christian, when you subscribe to my newsletter, as well as the opening chapter of the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book. So you'll get both those chapters when you subscribe to my newsletter. And we don't spam you with stuff. It's just a fortnightly update from my latest videos, articles, events, and resources, all to try and help you explore faith. But if you want to go one step further and actually support my work financially here on the podcast, I'd be so grateful. Silver supporters get early access episodes and bonus video content, and Gold supporters also get the chance for a monthly catch-up with me and signed copies of both my latest books, including that brand new title, Why I'm Still a Christian, after 2 decades of conversations with skeptics and atheists, the reason I believe. The link for the newsletter or to become a supporter is with today's show info. Coming up next time.
I see the incarnation, if you like, as God's final vote of confidence in the original model, humanity, the Mark I human being.
The future of AI. I'm live in London with Professor John Wyatt as we discuss what the emerging technology of AI means for the world, for the church, and for the surprising rebirth of belief in God. Look out for that next time. Thank you for listening to today's show. It's a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and the Jerusalem Trust. Editing assistance from Isaac Simmons. See you next time.
This message is brought to you by Abercrombie Kids, where the activewear is made for every summer activity, so your mini-me can bring their personal best. Summer days are always an adventure, from day camp to rec leagues and pool days. Abercrombie Kids has the shorts, tees, and swim to keep them comfy and keep up with them. Get everything for the entire summer at Abercrombie Kids. Shop in-store, online, or in the app.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at graduate hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Don't be left in the dark. Find out about our latest shows, upcoming events, and recent articles by subscribing to my Think Faith newsletter. It'll arrive once a fortnight, and I'll even send you the first chapters of both my books, Why I'm Still a Christian and The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, for free when you sign up. And if you want to support this show, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content when you become a silver supporter. Gold level supporters also get signed copies of both those books and the chance for a monthly catch-up with me. Your support makes a huge difference. The links for the newsletter or to support are with the show info, or go to justinbrierley.com.